I made a joke that since we're recording in the morning, that you'd put rum in your coffee. And I look over and you're actually doing it. Well, the joke was put in Baileys, and we didn't have any Baileys. So you just started putting rum in your coffee like some errant pirate.
It wasn't a joke.
It was a joke.
You made it very clear that I'm only tolerable when I have a shot of alcohol.
That's a completely separate point. So, I'm sitting on the couch. I'm 2 sips of coffee in, and you start ranting and raving about a Supreme Court case. Is this what Clarence Thomas's wife has to go through? No wonder she tried to insurrect. No. I'm sitting there, and you were talking about a court case that we had talked about on a previous podcast, and you did a little bit more research into it.
I don't think we actually brought it up. You and I talked about it.
Did we mention?
I don't think we ever mentioned it because we didn't know. We didn't want to bring it up because we weren't positive of the actual details.
Well, so
now I know some of the details.
Right. So to give a little bit of background to this is a Voting Rights Act case. It involves gerrymandering, really granular stuff, and it's in the state of Alabama.
Yes.
And there was a challenge done to the map that was drawn for...
Based off of the 2020 census.
Because they redraw the maps and say, this many people are in this district, and therefore, this is, how many, who votes.
So the case first came up in early 2022.
Okay.
Which, by the way, that should, on its face, be a little hinky. Well, it was redrawn in 2020.
Right.
Which meant it wouldn't be implemented until 2022.
Right.
So you're going to wait until early 2022, right before voting happens, to then say, oh, wait, we have a problem with this? Really?
Right. So
you're going to let a year go by before you say anything?
Right. So the thinking is that the maps are... The term gerrymandering has been used to apply to maps being drawn in these strange and unusual ways for congressional districts so that you can get the voters that you want to vote for the candidate of the party that you want.
So you can get the representation that you want, yes.
Right. So there are some maps that look, as a result, hilarious. Like you'll have a congressional district that bisects a city, surrounds another neighboring city, and then swings back and gets another area out in the middle of nowhere, and then comes back down.
As Sarah Esgar Flores calls them, dragon districts, which I think is a good name.
I like that. That sounds like a new, that sounds like something on Paramount Plus. So this is a situation that's been dealt with for at least the past few decades, because there's only a limited number of congressional seats, and different parties vie for their voters to come and vote for them, and there's different commissions in each state that determine who gets to decide how the maps are drawn. It has to be approved. It has to go through the legal system. Judges have to look at them. So it's a really complicated and wildly unnecessary process that I think should just be a grid. But tell us about jingles.
Well, but first of all, and again, this was a cogent thought that I could have had later, but it just occurred to me as we were talking. This was, again, as I said, the case was first brought up in early 2022, and they tried to put it on the emergency docket of the Supreme Court so they could rule on it immediately.
Right.
For the 2022 elections.
Right.
The midterms. And when it was ruled on the emergency docket, it ruled in favor of Alabama.
So the challenge was Alabama, the people in charge of drawing the maps for these states.
I should have said that, yes.
No, okay. I'll give the background. It's okay. You're drunk already. Not even 10. Alabama, the commission of people who draw these maps drew the maps for the next election based off of the census.
Yes.
They were challenged in court, and they were challenged on the basis of
race.
Race. So saying that a certain amount of the maps were drawn to basically diminish the representation of black voters in Alabama.
Because they were I believe in this case they were packed into one district. So
Right.
80% of the black of the black population in Alabama was pushed into one district, which I find a little hard to believe, quite honestly, because I imagine in Alabama they're pretty spread out. But okay, we'll go with your numbers. But basically, yeah, they were packed into one district, and because of the proportion of black people in the state, they felt well.
It diminished the representation.
Right. It is necessary that they should have two majority-minority districts.
Okay. So that's what this comes down to. And then there's also another... So there's two sort of... There's multiple standards that people who draw these maps have to deal with to avoid these kinds of legal challenges, because there are many. One of them is the Voting Rights Act, 1964, talking about making sure that there's equal access to voting
Yes.
and representation.
Yes.
I won't read it because it's it's an involved thing.
Right, but to be clear, the only mention of districting in the Voting Rights Act is with regards to packing and cracking, is what they call it.
Okay, so we got packing, and we got cracking.
Packing is what I just mentioned, putting a large amount of minority or racial group into one district. So
Okay.
packing them into one district, which diminishes their representation or their voting power. Or cracking, which is the opposite of taking a large minority group and spreading them out.
Diffusing them among multiple districts.
Multiple districts, so again, diminishing their voting power.
Okay, so we have two standards that we have to... This is, by the way, insane. If you told the average person this who does not know the specific text of the Voting Rights Act, they would be like, this is what our serious people that we elect do. They sit there and talk about packing and cracking all day. Like, what the fuck? So... This is the 1 and 2 standards that it has to meet. So you can't have too many black people in one district. You can't have too few black people in one district. Basically, it's what the Voting Rights Act is saying. Now, the third standard is something called jingles.
So yeah,
the Supreme Court cases are usually named after the plaintiff. I believe so. So that's why Roe v. Wade. They always talk about it Roe, even though that was a pseudonym for Jane Roe, is like a John Doe. So it's always called Roe. With this, it's called Jingles versus something.
I don't remember,
but it's called Jingles, which it's hilarious to me that these kind of situations get discussed in a serious way by them. Literally, 9 people in robes sitting around talking back and forth about jingles.
Well, and we only know that it's called Jingles because, who's the most senior member of the Supreme Court?
Clarence?
I don't think so. Maybe, I don't know.
I think he's the oldest.
One of the few members of the Supreme Court that's still around when Jingles was decided knows that it is pronounced Jingles because it's spelled Gingles with a G and not a J.
Gingles?
So, yes. So everyone was saying Gingles, and then one of the Supreme Court just, well, actually, it is Jingles or something like that.
You've got to be fucking kidding.
Anyway, this is a previous court case that has obviously set precedent. And it determined that, I guess, the Voting Rights Act wasn't enough. And basically it brought affirmative action to the voting districting.
So you're telling me that there's three standards that these people have to meet when they're drawing out congressional districts.
Right, so
now
Jingles
you can't pack them, you can't crack them, and now what does Jingles do?
Jingles
you gotta jingle them around a little bit.
Jingles basically said... you have to be proportional. So if you have, for example, if you have 5 districts in a state, and you have 30% black population, you need to have at least 2 districts that are majority minority. So because you have because you have 30% of the population, you need 30% of your districts to then represent those people. So one district of, majority black would not be enough in a state with 5 districts and 30% black population.
But what about 13% of the population and 50% of the... No, that's another thing. I don't understand. So you have 3 standards to meet, all of which sound like a juggling act. You can't have too many people in one district. You can have too few people among many districts. And now it has to be balanced in a proportional way. Mm-hmm. So this sounds pretty difficult to make everybody happy. And like it sounds like in this case in Alabama, now faces legal scrutiny for the way that they drew up these particular districts. So in a surprise decision, 6-3 with
5-4.
I thought it was 6-3.
I believe it was 5-4. The only defector was Kavanaugh.
No, but Roberts.
I thought it was 5-4.
No, I'm pretty sure it's 6-3 because you have 4 liberal members of the court. You have Ketanji Brown Jackson. You have Sotomayor. You have Kagan. Wasn't there one more? Because in the minority it was... Oh, no, maybe it might be 5-4 because in the minority you had Barrett...
Yeah,
Alito,
by a 5-4 vote, yeah.
Gorsuch, and Thomas. Okay, so it was 5-4.
Yeah, it was 5-4. The only one...
So Kavanaugh went over to the left, and of course,
yes,
Roberts went to the left. And so in a surprise move, they all the majority decision is now that the Alabama districts are in violation of the Voting Rights Act and now have to be redrawn again. So from what I understand, the plaintiffs in the Alabama case proposed over 30 different potential maps to do this, and even used, like, you know, you'd said, like a computer algorithm to determine, okay, how do we make sure that these numbers are balanced accordingly so that no one feels that their rights are being diminished?
Because also, again, according to the Voting Rights Act, you cannot take, basically, you cannot take race into account when districting, but you can take political affiliation or political party affiliation.
So you can say there's too many Democrats in this district, but you can't say there's too many white people in this district.
Right, but if you say there's too many Democrats in this district versus too many black people in this district, you're saying the same thing. This is where we run into a problem. But the point is, Alabama had their computer spit out a bunch of voting maps.
I didn't know they had one.
And they did not factor race into the algorithm because, sort of by law, you can't. And so the computer spit out a bunch of maps, and apparently none of those maps fit the Jingles criteria of having, you know, at least 2 majority-minority districts. And so that is why this was brought to court.
So they said, we tried, we did the best that we could, and the Supreme Court said that was not good enough.
Right, and so what pisses me off here is that because Alabama has a history of being, quote, a racist state, they're going to assume that this districting was race-based and not political party-based.
So there's almost like an automatic level of suspicion.
Yes.
It's like, oh, look, it's George Wallace all over again.
Right.
Because
you're a southern state, so obviously you've done this for racial reasons.
Well, that's interesting because are any of the you know, you want to talk about representation in locations. Are there any Supreme Court justices who voted in the majority who are from the South?
Are there any Supreme Court justices that are from the South, period? I don't know.
Are there any?
I don't think so.
No, let's pressure. I don't think, you know, obviously, Barrett, no. Kavanaugh, no.
Where's Clarence Thomas from?
I don't know. I think he might.
I believe his wife's from the South, but...
Okay. So, but in the affirmative, obviously Elena Kagan, no. Obviously Sotomayor, no. They're both, you know, New England.
Right.
So that's 2. Ketanji, I don't think so.
No.
So that's 3. So this is, you want to talk about representation. Where are the Southerners on the Supreme Court? Because throughout
put John Kennedy on the Supreme Court.
Well, you might as well at this point. But that's, you want to talk about, like, you know, representation, appropriate representation. The Supreme Court is not an equal body in how it represents the different aspects of the country, which is especially interesting because each of those justices is in charge of a district court. So if a case gets brought up to, like, they are the highest ranking person in that particular district, and there are ostensibly some that represent the South, even though they're not from the South. Yeah. So if we want to talk about the equality of representation, let's start with the Supreme Court, especially when we're saying we have to pick one person from this race, one person. What about one person from this region of the country to represent that portion of the country?
Right.
there is a lot of... I'm noticing from all backgrounds, there seems to be a great Southern erasure across the country when it comes to representing...
I'm not paying him to say this, folks.
No. I'm just saying this is an observation. As someone who is not a Southerner, I am noticing a relative kind of just, blurring of not even just the culture of the South, but the people from the South as part of the national conversation. I joked earlier, Alabama's only computer? But there are people who genuinely say that, and I think it's the only comfortable racism or discrimination that people will still say in American society. Because you can have a very woke woman from Seattle, you can have someone from Maine, you can have someone from, Southern California and from Texas all make fun of the South, and it's okay to do.
Well, and Alabama gets the worst brunt of it because even people from Louisiana, like my mother, we people from Louisiana, we have a rivalry with Alabama. That's
right.
It's football based, but still, it's a rivalry.
Makes fun of Alabama, like it's
right. But my mother will say, "Oh, well, Alabama. That's where those family tree, those lines don't fork." Like, yeah. So,
and by the way, I'm not including Florida in the South thing because Florida is an entirely different thing. But it is fascinating to me how that's an acceptable form of discrimination. So, okay. I think that Kavanaugh and Roberts' arguments were basically, we have a precedent here of a previous case, and we have to follow and apply this precedent of a previous case. What you were saying earlier is, why not use this as an opportunity to either enhance or change those particular rules? Why are the fucking gardeners here? In order for us to, we're going to have to pause because they decided to come here and do gardening.
We'll be right back after this short commercial break.
Now back after these messages.
What messages? Are you hearing things?
I'm just hearing live read ad copy. That's how I go to sleep.
No, so picking up where we left off, you were mentioning that...
Jingles.
No, there seems to be a discrimination from people in the South, which you're correct.
Yes.
But I wanted to bring this to the sort of bigger picture, which is, so we've discussed now the implications and all of this and the ruling. My question is, this is in the name of racism. This is in the name of fighting racism and systemic racism and all that stuff. But it's all a political game.
Right.
And we know this. But as long as they label it as fighting racism, it becomes noble and all of this. So I want to know how many times this kind of case has been brought against maybe like California. Is there have they districted correctly for the Hispanic population?
No, and I'll give you an example. Kevin McCarthy's district in Bakersfield actually bisects the city of Fresno in half and then stretches another 15 miles south of the city. So you can be on one side of a street and have a completely different congressional representative because that's how they've decided how the map goes. Like, it cuts the city along a line that does not exist. And so you have people who are your neighbors who have a different congressman or member of Congress representing you than you do.
Right.
For no reason other than they're trying to meet insane and impossible standards to make it fair.
I guess so. My point is, don't act like a hero saying I'm fighting racism when you're only doing this in states where you can get one more Democrat in a seat somewhere.
Right.
Like, you're kind of being racist by playing.
But they don't care.
You're playing against voting patterns. Like, you're using a group of people to
of course
get
they are.
a means
and that's the thing. That's why this is another reason why the meme of, well, Democrats are the real racists. Okay, that's a fine thing to admit. It would break a lot of people's minds in 2008, and it's done. They don't care. They don't care about being racist. They care about apportionment, getting the appropriate seats, and getting the votes to get the things done that they want to get done. And to people on the far left, by the way, they also don't care because you want a universal basic income and, climate equality and all the other, sort of whatever buzzwords that have been thrown, they'll pay lip service to that, and they also don't care. So this concept but they care about, that they care about racial, they don't. They will use whatever it takes to win. And this is why in these special Georgia runoff elections, which keeps happening in Georgia for some reason. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with Georgia when it comes to, like, we have to have a runoff, And so then whoever the Republican candidate is always loses every single time for some reason. Right. Like, it gets really close and then they lose. And they get close again and they lose. Like, they have gamed it so that they win, no matter what. So what do you do in a situation like that? Because right now, we've had the legislative branch deal with this, with apportionment of seats and, passing legislation and getting as many Democrats in there as possible. You have the executive branch, which has an enormous bureaucracy of people who are completely outside of the scope of accountability, some of which are there for forever. And now they're trying to push it into, this is why there is so much hate by the Democrats for the Supreme Court, because it's the last backstop of they can elect a president who can appoint a Supreme Court justice, but they can't directly elect a Supreme Court justice, and that bothers them. Because so happens that Trump got 3 Supreme Court justices in a single 4-year term. Right. That broke a lot of people on the left, which is also why there was this insane sort of lionization of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, even though they really hate her. Because she could have stepped down during Obama's term, they could have gotten another liberal justice, and everybody would have been happy.
Right.
So this is what all of this comes down to. And if it seems like Republicans are wildly uninterested in seeing it that way. Like, they're playing a completely different game of like, oh no, we lost again. Okay, well, they really don't want to win.
Clearly.
Against people who want nothing more than to win. They just have an unpopular message.
So I want to take this a step further, and with your permission, but
no.
I also want to say, to our listeners, to our listener, we've been talking a lot about Supreme Court stuff, but that's only because these decisions are coming out. Like,
there's a season when decisions
right.
are typically issued.
All of the kind of boring ones have come out first, which we talked about a few of them because they weren't so boring because they had implications within them. Well, the bigger ones are starting to come out now. So
last year we discussed those when they came out, because we actually now have a year under our belt doing this crap.
Yeah.
And so we can talk about so now we can talk about how last year at this time we were discussing the Roe v. Wade thing.
Yeah.
That's the biggest Supreme Court decision of maybe the past, couple decades, maybe more. I mean, it overturned a decision from the past 50 years, so that's a big deal. But we haven't had as many big deals lately.
Right, but the big ones are coming out. So this Voting Rights Act, one was a big one. And the other really big one that I'm interested in is the Harvard and UNC, again, race-based
Is it affirmative action?
Yes.
I feel like affirmative action always gets knocked down, and then they're like, oh, but we're still going to implicitly use it. That seems like a weird...
In this case, affirmative action might actually lose in a certain way because they were giving preference to black students over Asian students. So now you're pitting two minorities against each other.
But as we've learned, and this is another thing where people shit on California, but if you ignore California, you ignore how the whole thing's working. Years ago, the UC system was University of California, one of the largest university systems in the country, was found to use a mathematical equation of a point system that they assigned to every single student. So, got a certain SAT score, this number of points. Did this, certain number of points. And then when it finally came down to the question of race and ethnic origin, white students got a minus 100 out of their points, or for being white. Asian students got a minus 150 for being Asian. Black students got like a plus 250. Hispanic students got like a plus 50. Like, there was this racial-based point system that someone had to sue, subpoena. They went through all the documentation. They were like, wait a second, you've been using this the entire time? And they're like, oh yeah, we thought this was the only equitable way to do it. When in fact, the most affirmative of affirmative action systems is the SAT testing system. because that will suss out from whatever background you're from whatever, experience you have, whatever race you are you apt enough to handle these college level concepts? Yes or no? So now that those are being done away with completely, that is the last actual real form of positive affirmative action, and now we only have left negative, racial quota systems of affirmative action.
Well, and yeah, again,
and it's become a TikTok meme too. Of there was that one Asian kid who said, "I got an almost perfect score on all my SATs. I took X number of AP classes. I got this GPA, and I got rejected from these 13 schools." That's kind of where we're at this point.
And we'll revisit some of this when that decision comes out, which actually should be in the next week or so, because we're running out of time.
Right? They have
until the end of the month.
It's so funny how they're like, okay, decisions will start coming out, and then one day they'll just be like, boom, we did this. Boom, we did, and it sets the whole news for that whole day. And
sometimes they'll drop 3 at a time when they're really in a time crunch. But so that one will come out in the next few weeks, and we'll talk about it. But right. I wanna finish this by putting all of this systemic racism stuff, which was at the backbone of the Voting Rights Act and all of this, into perspective, because David French, who, for all intents and purposes is a moderate conservative. When he uses an example that he thinks is kind of airtight of how systemic racism works. And so he gives the example of, let's say that you have a boss who is hiring, you have a boss, someone who owns a company,
and your bills have been affected,
who's hiring within a friend group. So you have a white boss, and he's hiring for a job, and he's like, oh, well, a friend of mine has this son, and he would be perfect. He has the education, he has the knowledge.
Right.
So this form of nepotism sort of leads to, okay, you're friends with this person, so you're going to hire his kid, and while this maybe black kid over here who's equally as qualified gets overlooked because you're not friends with his parents.
Okay.
So this is the ingrained systemic racism, where it's not that someone's bad, it's not that someone is racist or acting on a racist tendency, but it's just built within the system of, I don't know you, so I'm not going to give you, a leg up.
Right.
And so that has been happening because, because it's a majority white population in this country. That's what majority means.
Despite their damnedest efforts.
You have a lot of people in this position of, here's this white person in a position of power. They're going to hire someone that they might know versus someone else who they might not know.
By the way, anybody who thinks that has never hired somebody for a job ever. They've never actually gone through the candidates. They've never actually had an open call for people to come and fill a job. They've never seen the actual applications that come through. They don't know shit.
But my problem with this is the linguistic notion that this is somehow racist. By my definition, racism sort of entails sort of a knowingly doing something against a race.
Right.
So this idea of just labeling it systemic racism makes it sound really bad when you're just saying, I'm friends with this person, I'm going to give them preferential treatment over someone that I don't know. And it works both ways. If a black person were in a position of power, they might hire one of their friends who happens to also be black and ignore this white kid. Is that not a form of systemic racism by your definition?
But then the justification gets made. They'd be justified in doing it because doing that is opening up an opportunity for a community that's been historically blah, 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 blah. That's usually what the line is that's used.
Right.
By the way, they never go into the smaller minority groups and do this. They never go into Asian minority groups or Indian minority groups or anything like that and complain about it. They don't complain about a construction site that's majority Hispanic not hiring a black or white applicant.
But if you're going to call basically nepotism systemic racism, I have a problem with that labeling, I guess. There's nothing there's nothing actively wrong in doing that scenario, but it's considered racist. Well, I don't understand.
Well, the thing that's fascinating to me is that they're expecting a small business owner to function like a government agency where they receive 100 applications and they're all pre-screened and it's blind screening and they just choose like no names, no backgrounds, no nothing, but they just press a button. AI determines who has the highest qualification and then this person gets hired. When, in fact, that's not how business works. Many businesses across the country exist to service the local community and therefore will hire from the local community to service the local community. Usually communities have elementary, middle, and high schools that are the services for the parents and families that are in that community. Children go through that educational system. Then they choose to have children in that community, and then they get hired to do jobs for that community. And I think that the best example is a local insurance agency. Because the whole point of having a community local insurance agency and an office that's like near the supermarket or near the grocery store in your area is that they service that particular area. It's usually somebody that you know or someone's son or brother or cousin or, daughter or wife who runs it and then hires younger people to come and work in there, which is a decent job and you can make a very good living doing it from within that community. And that happens in every single community. You will see Armenian insurance agents in Armenian areas. You will see black insurance agents in black areas. You will see Asian insurance agents because they speak to that community, sometimes speak the language of people in that community. They understand the community, and sometimes they face unique challenges. That's always the term that's used, unique challenges. So saying that somebody who runs an insurance agency in a majority Chinese neighborhood would be looking for somebody who is Swedish to come and work in their office who has no Chinese background, cannot speak the language, of course they're not going to hire that person. That person does not know anything about the community they're working in. And doing something like being an insurance agent is more than just stamping a paper and doing a job. So that's kind of what it comes down to. You can't have the idea of we have to support the community and uplift and work and build our own communities and our own things and everything like that. And then also say, we feel left out because you didn't consider us for jobs that were wildly outside of the scope of what we wanted to do or belong to. It doesn't make any sense. And this is the other thing where the biggest flattener of all is either poverty or wealth. With a lot of wealth in a multi-million dollar neighborhood, no one gives a fuck what race you are, okay? You have wealthy white retirees. You have a guy who started a small business who's Asian. You have, successful black entrepreneurs, you have athletes, you have celebrities. They all live in Hidden Hills. No one's in the city of Hidden Hills or Cameo Shores or Crystal Cove or whatever, or Rancho Santa Fe is like, oh no, there's a black person moving in a neighborhood. If you can afford an $18 million house, we don't give a fuck who you are.
Right.
The other thing that erases it is severe poverty. Everyone's struggling at the same level. The people in line at the food bank do not care if you're white or black. You're there to get your turkey, and then you move it along. You're not going to be like, to get those people away from it. You're all struggling. You all can't pay the bills. You all are in a bad position. And that's why they say that the two groups in this country that are the most alike are poorest whites and poorest blacks. Similar education, similar backgrounds, similar propensity to, whatever. Okay. So wealth, in a lot of ways, is the great flattener in these situations. It's only when you start to get into middle class and upper middle class do you see these weird hoops that people jump through to prove that they are not racist from whatever perspective, whether it's congressional district apportioning or job hiring or, nominating people to the Supreme Court or whatever. And it's fascinating to me because I think the only real differences in this country are regional. And that's something that nobody has any interest in changing. Because a poor white person from the South and a poor black person from the South or a poor Asian person from the South or a poor Mexican person from the South will all be treated like an idiot if they speak in a Southern accent.
I wanted to have this conversation on a different episode, but it now makes sense to bring it up. Just really, really, really briefly. I've been rewatching a lot of stuff on Peacock. I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Some of the Bravo shows. So I started rewatching the Southern Charm New Orleans, which, very short-lived show, actually pretty entertaining.
Right.
But there is a character on a character. There's a cast member on there, or a friend of a cast member, who is a gay black man.
Okay.
And at the beginning,
Get that thong out your pussy, player.
at the beginning, he is not openly gay, so he
Right.
comes out in the course of the show. And it got me thinking, because I saw him talking about it and all of this stuff. Because there was a big ordeal about the F word, being used.
Oh, I thought it was a different word.
Not fuck, but the
Fuck?
other
Was
one.
fuck not censored on Bravo?
So he was talking about the use of that word, and he said, I am a gay man. But it got me thinking. As someone from the South, as someone who grew up around, a lot of black people, especially going to college, the hardest and most oppressed people, I think, in this country are gay black people from the South.
Right.
Because
Don Lemon.
yeah,
Who you would not
no,
know-
in a
who, by
way,
the
yeah.
Who, by the way, is barely black. No, this is interesting. I don't mean to step on your point. Don Lemon is culturally and appears culturally very white. But part of it is the gay identifier for him is like he's gay and he's black and it's a token. He mentions the South very sparingly, but at the beginning, from his accent has been sort of like shoved into this very like newscaster accent. You would not know he's from this. He only brings it up as point of being a victim, but you don't know he's from the South. He spends his time in the Hamptons, not a Southerner. So it's fascinating to me that the one if he has three identifiers, gay, black, and Southern, the one he has to hide the most is being Southern.
Yeah.
Southerners need to come out. Where's Southern Pride Month? But anyway, yeah, you were saying like the triple threat of minority, gay, black, and Southern, they're the ones who have it hard.
In all honesty, because not only are you in the South where, again,
You're a little sweet.
gay is becoming acceptable, but it's very religious. I understand, the implications of all of that. But then also being part of a community that puts masculinity, especially within the male sex. I'm making a point here.
Yeah, no, I get it.
That puts masculinity at a huge, what's the word I'm looking for? Like somewhat
Priority. It's a huge priority.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for.
And so even if you are gay and black, you have to be very
ultra masculine. Yes,
yeah.
yes. So, and within that community, they stereotype the gay people as being ultra feminine when that's not necessarily true. So this
Are you on the DL player?
this kind of homophobia, and I use that word because there's no other word to use, and I don't know what else to call it. This perceived homophobia within the black community is never talked about, and especially it's heightened in the Southern black community.
Right.
And so I was watching the show, and I was watching him sort of break down about it, and I'm like, having lived part of that experience, I understand that his was probably 10 times worse.
Yeah.
Because of his skin color. And so, I don't know, I wanted to hammer home the point of there's ingrained and if you want to use the word systemic homophobia within the black community.
Oh, no one wants to talk about that.
But that's not ever something anyone wants to bring up. Like, it irritates me, I guess, is my point.
Well, no, that's true. I said, well, no, but it is true. Well, no, but it's fascinating to me that the only acceptable discrimination in American life is Southern. It's why they can take down monuments and they can erase parts of Southern history. People from all over the country can say nasty things about the South. And Florida, in a sense, is almost like distance itself from the rest of the South. So they mean like this very sort of this thin line between Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, this like sort of band.
And South Carolina.
And South Carolina, yeah, sort of stretches up. And that's very interesting to me. And it also goes to show that I think that not to bring up an additional point on top of what we were talking about, but I think that this sort of very pervasive and very white focus on you're all homophobes and transphobes and everything like this, and you forcing this acceptance of other things that go way beyond just gay or straight, is a form of discrimination against certain communities. The black community, the Hispanic community, the Asian community, because it's in those cultures that you'll be like, no. Like, this is not, like, you're not changing gender, you're not doing this, you're not doing all that stuff. And I feel like when you see it being that sort of the trans pride flag being raised at army bases, and you see it in these very white corporations and white institutions, it is a signaling that is pushing against minority groups in a lot of ways. It's an acceptable way of being like, you're not accepting enough. It's a form of discrimination. And it is fascinating to me that happens. Because yes, within communities, it is harder to, quote, come out than it is if you're just a Susie Chapstick in Kansas. Like, it's okay to just be a, lesbian. So I am fascinated by that concept, because I think the further we get down the alphabet line, the more racist it becomes. And you see that with the backlash to the school protests, where the Armenian community, the black community, the Mexican community, more traditional communities, immigrant communities, Muslim communities, all of a sudden, these people are saying the Muslims need to be thrown out of the country. The second that they say we don't want our kids, the second that the kids start stomping on pride flags instead of Israeli flags, all of a sudden it's a problem. So that is fascinating to me that there's a sort of the discrimination thing has swung so far into one direction.
You will not find a more socially conservative group of people than the black people of the Deep South.
Right.
Like, politically liberal, which baffles me because they're going to vote for someone who is not socially conservative in the slightest.
Fiscally liberal, socially conservative.
But
like Dennis from 30.
But they literally, I have seen white Southern people, family members of mine, who are less socially conservative than some of the black people, and that's never talked about.
Well, I think that fundamentally, it's so funny the sort of like fiscally conservative, socially liberal of this sort of like, I'm a surfer, do what you want, bro, but don't pay my taxes. Like, that sort of, there's that sort of California mindset. I think that people don't realize that the majority of the country is socially conservative, fiscally liberal. Like, they're like, please spend tax dollars on whatever the fuck you want. Like, we want social programs. We want the government to take care of us, but we don't want them to tell us how to live. That is the fundamental thing that I don't think many of these Republicans running who are like, and the Constitution, they don't give a fuck. The majority of Americans do not give a fuck. They want their programs, they want Social Security and Medicare. They feel entitled to it because they did pay into it. And they also don't want the government shoving a trans flag down their, down their throats. So that is a very interesting thing of there's the real divide in this country is between fiscally conservative socially liberals and fiscally liberal social conservatives, and those things do not intersect. So we've delved into a lot of different areas.
Yes, sorry.
No, this is good. This ended up being a full up, but
yeah, no.
But as they say in the Deep South,
more Supreme Court stuff to come. That is not what they say in the Deep South.
No, I teed you up.
I know.
I teed you up, and you walked down to the ladies' tees. Like, you just, I teed you up, and you were like Caitlin. You were just like, I'm gonna shoot from the ladies because I'll beat you sons of bitches out of the court. So, all right, let me tee you up again. As they say in the Deep South,
have some sweet tea and go fuck yourselves.
There we go.